I made lace from Hollow Knight Silksong in Blender for 3D printing, and in this video I will show you how. I started with the head. In this case, I used a curve, gave it a bevel, I moved the points to make the main shape of her head, then I turned it into a mesh and started sculpting a bit to give it some shape. In the beginning you don't need to care about details, it's just about the silhouettes and proportions. This first stage is known as blockout or blocking. As I said, you need to focus only in model simple shapes with the purpose of having a base, which one you will detail later. To create the body, I added a plane and merged it in the center, so we only had two vertices. Then I added a skin modifier to create geometry around those vertices. Next, I added a subdivision and a mirror modifier, and placed the last one above the other two. I continue by creating new vertices and positioning them to form the body. With Ctrl A, we can increase or decrease the scale of the vertex, but this is only possible if we have the skin modifier. Then I start modeling the weapon using curve. And as we did with the head, we just move the points of the curves to give it the shape that we want. Now I begin to add some details to Lei's head, marking where to make the cuts and adjusting the brush parameters to achieve a better result. For the eyes, I use a mask and drew where I want them to be. Everything drawn with the mask will not be affected by the changes we make to the mesh. What we do now is invert the mask so that everything is masked except the area where we want to sculpt. I smooth the edges a bit and create the eyes holes. Once the head is well defined, the next step is to perform a retopology to leave it ready. Retopology is the process of creating a new low-poly version of the previous mesh we sculpt. The sculpted mesh is usually very dense and can cause performance issues later on. This dense mesh is known as high poly. The most optimized way to work is to perform a retopology using the high poly mesh as a base for the low poly version. For this, it is essential to have the snap option enabled in face projection mode. This way, whatever we move, rotate or scale will stay attached to the surface underneath, in this case our high poly model. We continue extruding, merging vertices and so on until we complete the entire model. I know it may seem very tedious at first, but for me it feels very rewarding to see how it turns out. This process is also very creative, since you learn about topology, edge flows and more. If you agree, I can make a video about these topics. I feel it's quite interesting and it's something that many artists overlook. To keep everything organized, we create collections, renamed the models, and duplicated them to have backups. And now, since retopology is generally disliked by many artists, we come to what many find terrifying: UV mapping. I created seams in our model for when we do the unwrapping. This is a fairly simple process, but it can be confusing and stressful, since at the beginning it's normal that it doesn't turn out well. The key is to identify what is wrong and correct it. I could also make a video about this. It's interesting and can be the key to make your model looks better, so you know. At this point I already had an editable backup model and another one to keep working on. When I went to make the seams on Lei's weapon, I realized that I hadn't worked on this mesh yet, so I had to optimize it by reducing unnecessary vertices. With our model and its UV map ready, it's time to create the materials. I created one for each object, then I created a texture for the color and did a bake to draw the colors onto that texture. I can do the same for the texture that represents the metal and for all the others I need. With the model ready and its texture prepared, the next step is to rig it so we can put it into a pose. I continue with the rigging, which was nothing more than creating the bones I used to move our character. For this, I use an add-on that came by default in Blender. You should have to look for it in the preferences and activate it. Then I create a human skeleton, but this one had bones that I didn't need, such as the fingers, since Lei's didn't have them. The same happened with these two here, the ones for the face and another one that was hidden right here. With the skeleton ready, I clicked on generate rig and a new skeleton was automatically created, prepared for posing. For the weapon, I simply create a single bone and positioned it. Then I linked the model to the skeleton and it was done. As you will see, when I move a bone, the corresponding part of the model moved as well. I continue by creating the base, and for this I needed roses, since it was in a place full of them where we fight late for the second time. I made a cylinder and started shaping it the way that I wanted. I adjust the size, correct the forms, and that was it. Then I use a particle system to instantiate the roses on the cylinder we had just created. I select the collection where I had the rose, and for optimization purpose to improve performance while working, I added a decimate modifier. This way, only in the viewport we have a lighter version of our model. Then it was time to pose lace, so we create the camera and positioned it from the angle I wanted. I adjust the influence of some bones so that each bones affect only the part of the mesh that it was supposed to affect. I continue posing and correcting things whenever I need to. I create some shape keys to manipulate certain parts of the model, in this case the eyes, since I wanted to control how open or closed they were. I organize the model and prepare ourselves to create the material for the base. We use noise textures, ambient occlusion nodes, and others like the geometry node to attain curvature. And with this we create some pretty cool effects in the color of the base, so it wasn't just a flat color. Note: the curvature can only be seen if you are working in cycles. If you want to see it in Eevee, it becomes a bit more complicated because you will need add-ons or something else like working with geometry nodes or anything else. End of the note. I use color ramp nodes to adjust the value of both the ambient occlusion and the curvature node. And now it was time to create a scene where we could place the model. I added the light from above to have general illumination for the scene. I create a light behind the model and adjust it until I had the result that I like. With the purpose of defining the silhouette of my character, I use the light linking function to make sure this light affects only my model. I then added a depth of field effect to the camera so it focused only lace. In this case it was subtle, but it was a nice plus. Next, I create the petals that would be flying around lace, made different ones to have variety, added them to a collection, created an emitter plane for these petals, and adjusted their size, rotation, and speed. I create a wind effect and adjusted its intensity. I made a material for the petals, corrected some details in the scene, and added a turbulence effect to have more randomness in the fall of the petals. After that, I create another emitter plane, this time one that emits dust particles. Finally, I create the materials for this as well, adding some noise nodes to achieve more body transparency. To further improve the atmosphere of the scene, I created a cube around it, and in its material I set up a volume. I ran some tests, but in the end I decided to use principal volume with a noise texture to add variety to the density of the volume, and with a color ramp node I adjusted that variety. Then I changed one of the light from area to spotlight, so there was a cone that illuminated the character and made the volume look more defined. I adjusted the lights, their intensity and their size, and once again I used light linking to make certain light affect only specific models. I corrected some shapes details in the pose of the character and create new shape keys to fix certain deformation that the mesh has suffered when it was posed. I created the material for the roses and used nodes that had already been shown before to improve their color. I kept correcting the model, which was perfectly normal and an important part of the creative process. Working and making adjustments as I went was essential because maybe not at the moment, but later there were always things to fix, details that had gone unnoticed at the time. Then I wanted to improve the shadow of the base even more, and by using imperfection texture and mixing them with a curvature, I achieved the result I was looking for. At that point the model was ready, and when a render was made, it produced this beautiful result. But I didn't stop there. Once I have Lace ready, it was time to make the Lost version. If you've reached Act 3 of Silksong, you already know that not only the environment is affected by the void, but also some NPCs. Lace was no exception, since in her Lost version, she ended up being the final boss of Silksong. Sorry for the spoiler, but you were informed. And the fight was brutal, the music was epic, and I must stop here because I could make an entire video just about the design of this final fight. The point is, I love it so much that I decided to make her as well. And since Lace was already done, the only thing that I had to change was her color, because she was consumed by the void and becomes dark, her pose, and some characteristic element of the environment where she appears, as well as modifying the base. Just as I had done with the previous scene, I also made this one. I added a couple flies, volume, particles, turbulence effects, and I also used shape keys to correct part of the mesh that were deformed when I posed the model. In addition, I made the void strings that were spread throughout the scene. I used the displace modifier to add variation to their shape, created protruding fringes from them, duplicated and modified the existing ones, and everything was ready for the final render. Did you make it this far? Thank you. Now I'm going to ask you to give me just a seconds of your time. If you want to get the STL files to print them, the link is in the description or in the pinned comment. And using the code you see on the screen, on the Cults page, you will get a 30% discount not only on the STL models, but also on the models you see here. I will also be leaving a pack with both versions of Lace, where if you apply this code, you will be able to get them for an even lower price. Alright then, thank you for watching this video and see you next time.